"Nobody wants you," my sister sneered. Then the mob boss crossed the ballroom for me. All I had was a borrowed dress, hidden debts, and shame burning across my face, until Lucien Draven crossed the room and held out his hand in front of everyone. Celestine said nobody wanted me. He proved her wrong without raising his voice. But Lucien didn't offer me love. He offered me a dangerous farce, with a deadline, a price, and blood between the lines. I accepted to survive. I just didn't realize he was already looking at me like I was his. When the lie came down, the ballroom wasn't enough, because Lucien Draven hadn't crossed that floor to defend me. He'd crossed it to turn me into the most dangerous debt of his life. Hi, I'm Lena. A special shout out to those of you watching Book 1 for free here on the My Stories platform, completely ad-free and uninterrupted. Chapter 1. The Glass Raised at the Ball. The phone rang before coffee. I knew who it was by the time. 7:12 in the morning. Always the same number locked on the screen. Always the same tired voice on the other end pretending to have patience for one more morning with me. I answered in my underwear and a baggy shirt, barefoot on the cold kitchen floor, with the phone pressed to my ear and my eyes glued to my father's bedroom door to make sure he was still asleep. "Miss Vera, it's 42,000 now," the collector said with the rehearsed patience of someone who'd learned that yelling didn't work on me. "With this week's interest." I closed my eyes. 42,000. The week before it was 38. The week before that, 34. That was how time was measured in my life, by how fast one debt swallowed another before I could catch up. "I'll deposit on Friday," I answered, low, the way I talked to every man who came collecting something from my father. "Like always." "You said that last week, ma'am." "And I deposited last week. 1,200. 42,000 is a different conversation." I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. My paycheck from the gallery didn't cover half of that, and my father, who slept peacefully on the other side of the wall, thought his problem was around 10 grand. I'd kept the books separate for over a year. The real one stayed with me. The clean version stayed with him. It was the only thing I'd ever learned to do well, protect the man who had never protected me. I hung up without promising anything. I put the kettle on. I looked at my own reflection in the dark glass of the microwave, dark hair falling to my shoulders, the 2 red streaks I dyed myself at home, in secret, for almost 12 years. The one thing in me no one had managed to erase. My mother wore the exact same color. Mireia had died when I was 12, in an accident no one had ever quite been able to explain. And 2 months later, I'd taken the dye hidden at the bottom of her purse and done the first streak. My father yelled. Celestine laughed. I never stopped. The kettle whistled. I poured the sweet tea, the way my mother used to pour hers, and got ready for work. The gallery was on the Upper East Side, on a cramped ground floor wedged between a jewelry store that sold more sparkle than stone and a restaurant where none of my full paychecks would have covered a single dinner. I got there before everyone. I turned on the lights, lined up the catalogs, checked last month's red numbers pretending they'd ever turn black. Ren came in slamming the glass door like the world was her fault. Like, I swear on my dog, if I take one more packed Subway, I'm turning into an old movie villain, she said, throwing her bag on the counter. You know that shark movie? I'm the shark. I laughed without meaning to. Ren was the only person who made me laugh without warning. She had choppy blonde hair, huge glasses she didn't need, and the vocabulary of a girl who learned about life through her mom's filmography. You're 15 minutes late, I said, straightening the collar of my blouse. And you look like you didn't sleep. Ren looked me up and down. Again, this is going to turn into one of those movies where the lead drops dead on the floor and finds out she's been dead the whole time. I'm alive, Ren. For now. She leaned her elbows on the counter. You going to the Montclair ball tonight? I froze. The Montclair ball had been the one thing I'd sworn to myself I would avoid that winter. It was the kind of event where my sister shone, and I disappeared, and I'd already disappeared enough that month. I'm not going. Bet you are. I'm really not. Ren gave me a crooked smile. Like, your love life has the plot of that movie where the guy dies in the opening scene. You need any ball you can get. I didn't answer. The gallery phone rang, and I silently thanked it for giving me an excuse to turn my back. I got home at 4 in the afternoon. I walked up the 5 flights because the elevator had broken again. I opened the door with the key that creaked, and I heard my sister's voice before I'd even figured out she was in my room. Celestine. I dropped my bag on the floor and ran down the narrow hallway. She was on her knees in front of my dresser, the bottom drawer open, with the velvet box already in her hand. the little box where my mother had kept her ring. "Get out of there," I said, my voice firmer than I expected it to be. Celestine lifted her chin, blonde, tall, with skin that looked like it had never learned what tired meant. 28 years of life had landed on her like a compliment. On me, like a bill. "I'm just borrowing it," she said, opening the box with the calm of someone who had never been told no. "I need something on my hands tonight. The dress alone isn't convincing." "That's Mom's." It was. She lifted the ring and turned it in the window light. "Now it's an object. You keep it in a drawer. I wear it. Makes more sense." I stepped forward. It was instinct. It was all the wrong way to come at her, and Celestine closed her fist before I could reach it. Her fingers were stronger than they looked. Mine were shaking. "Give it back. You're making a scene. Give it back, Celestine." "Dad!" Her voice cut through the apartment. I heard my father's footsteps before I could breathe, and my bedroom door opened with that creak I'd known since I was a kid. Augustus Vera walked in a wrinkled shirt, unshaven, with the look of a man who had decided a long time ago which of his 2 daughters was worth the cost of a single word. "Dad, she's taking Mom's ring," I said. He looked at Celestine. He looked at me, and he sighed the way he always sighed, the sigh that always meant, "Why don't you make this easier? Let her wear it, Isolde. It's one night. It's Mom's. It's a ring." I shut my mouth. It was like swallowing glass. Celestine smiled without showing her teeth and slid the ring onto her own finger, and for 1 second I thought about tearing her hand off with it. "And you're going with her tonight," my father went on, without looking at me. "The Montclairs invited the family. A missing daughter draws attention." "I wasn't invited." "Yes, you were. Your sister asked." Celestine let out a low laugh. "I'm generous, Isolde. You should thank me." I didn't thank her. I didn't say anything. I closed the bedroom door with Celestine still inside, and sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the open drawer, empty where my mother's ring had lived for 12 years, and for one very brief instant, I thought about running away, grabbing my bag, walking down the 5 flights, and never coming back. But I had nowhere to go. I'd known that since I was 12. The Montclair ballroom shone like it had swallowed every light in New York, and spat out only the expensive ones. Crystal chandeliers heavy as threats, reflective cream marble, women in satin gowns that cost more than 6 months of my rent. The air smelled of cold champagne, expensive perfume, and everything I wasn't. Celestine walked in ahead of me as if I were her shadow, and that was the job. Everyone in that room knew it. She greeted 3 families before she'd even taken off her coat. I stayed 2 steps behind, in the most understated dress I'd been able to find, silver and simple, and tried to keep myself busy holding the glass a waiter had handed me out of reflex. The first hour was bearable. The second started to hurt. Celestine threw back 2 glasses fast, the way she did, without losing her posture. I saw it in her eyes the moment she decided she needed an audience. It was quick, the flicker of someone finding an excuse to hurt. She turned toward the circle of heiresses on her right, all younger than her, all small mirrors of the same trained laugh. "Girls," Celestine raised her glass. "Meet my sister." The others looked at me. I felt the heat crawl up my neck. "Isolde," Celestine went on, loud, her voice pitched to reach 3 conversations back. "She's been coming to these balls for 3 years now. She doesn't go out with anyone. Never has." The heiress on the left laughed early, anticipating. Celestine lowered her glass. Her blue eyes locked on mine. "Nobody wants you, Isolde. Not for money, not out of pity." The laughter came in a wave. First her circle, then the men behind, then women who hadn't even heard the whole line but laughed because it was safe to laugh. I heard the sound like it was coming from underwater. I felt the whole ballroom look at me and, at the same time, look right through me like glass. I wasn't even there. I had never been anywhere. I lowered my head. It was automatic. 12 years of practice. I looked at the cream marble floor and counted the dark veins to keep from crying. That was when the footsteps started crossing the floor. They weren't a waiter's steps. They weren't a woman's steps. They were heavy, evenly spaced, with the rhythm of someone who didn't care whether the world would make way, and the world made way. I saw it from the tips of his shoes first. Black, polished, no excessive shine, the kind that cost an entire factory's silence. When I raised my face, he was already standing in front of me. I had never seen Lucian Draven up close. I'd seen blurry photographs in headlines, a magazine profile, the kind of name that turned up on the covers of financial papers under the caption, "Magnate," and in low elevator conversations with words no one ever finished. I'd read in some headline that he was 31, and even so he looked like he had 50 years of worn-out patience. Dark hair, impeccable, a jawline that cut light, eyes gray as morning steel, a black suit with no detail, hands with small scars I registered before I knew why. He held out his hand. Dance with me. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an invitation. It was the kind of sentence men like him learned to use before they learned to shave. 2 words, 2 seconds, and the entire room understood that I was no longer anyone's shadow. Celestine recovered first. She let out a short little laugh, the way she did when she needed time. Mr. Draven, I think there's been a mistake. I'm Celestine. That's the other one. He didn't look at her. The gray eyes didn't leave mine. When he answered, his voice came out low, calm, with the lethal lightness of a man who had never had to repeat himself in his life. I never confuse an ordinary woman with a dangerous one. The room went silent. I saw, without moving my face, 3 glasses freeze halfway to 3 open mouths. I saw Celestine lose color for the first time in 28 years. I saw the heiress on the left take half a step back, as if the sentence might splash on her too, and I felt, in a deep place in my chest, I'd forgotten how to use, something hot rise up and push my chin a millimeter higher. His hand was still extended. I looked at the long fingers, the white scars on the back of his hand, the missing ring on his ring finger, and I realized I had 2 choices: lower my head again and disappear into the marble floor, or take the hand of a man I knew nothing about beyond his name. I set the glass down on the nearest waiter without looking. I laid my hand over his. Lucian Draven's fingers closed around mine, and the entire room, in absolute silence, understood with me that something had shifted, and that maybe there was no going back. Chapter 2. The Hand That Doesn't Let Go. The dance floor opened up for us the way the Red Sea opened for far holier people than me. Lucian led me to the center with the calm of someone who had done it 1,000 times in 1,000 ballrooms, and I followed because, honestly, there was nothing else to do. The string quartet reacted late. They started some waltz 1 beat after they should have, as if even the musicians had needed to pull themselves back together. He set his right hand against my waist and lifted the left with mine on top, and I felt, under the thin fabric of the dress, the heat of his palm, as if I'd just leaned against a fireplace. "Breathe, Vera," he said, low, barely moving his lips more than necessary. "I don't bite on the dance floor." And off it, the question slipped out before I'd authorized it. Lucian glanced down, the corner of his mouth almost twisting into something that wasn't a smile and wasn't quite irony. Depends on who's asking. I kept my eyes on the knot of his tie. It was safer than his face. It was safer than the room. I could feel, without needing to look, that every pair of eyes in the New York elite was nailed to the back of my neck, and that Celestine, somewhere to my left, was learning the taste of a humiliation she had never tried before. "Why did you do it?" I asked. "Do what?" Across the room, he turned me slowly with the hand firm at my waist, and when I looked up at him again, his gaze had gone darker. "Why do you let your sister talk to you like that?" I froze. It wasn't the question I'd expected. It was the question I hadn't asked myself in 12 years, and maybe because of that, maybe because of the champagne, maybe because he had crossed a whole ballroom just to stop in front of me, I let the sharp tongue slip for the first time that night. "Some prisons share your same blood, Mr. Draven." I finally lifted my eyes. "I'm sure you understand." He understood. I saw it in the way his jaw relaxed half a millimeter, as if I'd hit a point no one had ever had the courage to aim at before. He almost smiled. Almost. "What's your full name, Isolde?" "Isolde Vera." His hand at my waist didn't move, but the fingers of my right hand, caught in his, felt the pressure change for a fraction of a second. A short, involuntary squeeze, as if the surname had traveled through his body before it reached his ears. I looked at his hand, then at his face, and he had already locked everything back down. The mask returned in less than a blink. I registered it. I chalked it up to the reputation of the surname. Vera carried known debts in every gray office in the city. Maybe he had simply recognized that he was dancing with a debtor's daughter. It was the reasonable explanation. It was the comfortable explanation. The waltz ended. Lucian let me go slowly, holding my hand a second longer than protocol called for, and instead of stepping back, he guided me by the elbow to the edge of the floor, away from Celestine, away from the circle still watching us in silence. Only there, beside one of the marble columns, did he tip his head in a brief acknowledgement. "Bram's at the side door," he said, low. "He'll drive you whenever you want to leave." I didn't go back to Celestine. I crossed the room without looking at anyone, picked up my coat, and walked out the side door. Bram was waiting leaning against the car, and that's how I left. alone in the back seat, but not abandoned in the middle of the floor in front of the entire room. 3 days later, I was at the cramped kitchen sink washing the lunch dishes when I heard the first kick at the door. Augustus Vera, open the door. I shut off the faucet. My father was in the armchair in the living room, reading a 2-day-old paper, and he lifted his chin from the page with the face of a man pretending not to have heard. I dried my hands on the dish towel and looked at him. Dad, don't answer. Dad, they're going to break it down. Another kick. The door shook in its hinges. I grabbed the phone off the table and was about to dial emergency when the sound changed. Footsteps in the hallway. Different footsteps. 3 pairs of heavy shoes walking with the calm of men who'd just arrived at work. I heard low, muffled voices. The pounding on the door stopped suddenly, as if someone had put a hand between the kick and the wood, and the silence that came after was louder than the kicks. Then a small card slid under the door, white, thick, with nothing written on it except a raven engraved in black in the center. No name, no address, no number. I opened the door before my father could stop me. 3 men, dark suits, neutral faces, one of them slipping something into the inside pocket of his jacket with the calm of someone who'd just closed a deal. The one in the middle gave me a brief nod and said only one sentence. Those gentlemen won't be coming back, Mrs. Olda. I didn't ask his name. I couldn't. He turned his back, and the 3 of them went down the stairs, as if they had never been there. I closed the door. I pressed my forehead against the cold wood and tried to remember how to breathe. Dad, I said, without turning around. Who do you owe money to? Augustus Vera was standing now, the crumpled paper in his hand, pale. He swallowed hard before answering. I thought it was just common loan sharks, Isolde. I swear. But it wasn't. No. To who, Dad? He didn't answer. And I, standing in the narrow hallway with a raven card in my hand, realized I didn't need an answer. I already knew. Lucian showed up at the front steps of the building at midnight. I went down because the neighbor on the ground floor knocked on my door and said there was a man standing on the front stoop, and maybe I should come down, because the gentleman in question didn't look like the type who waited. I knew who it was before I got to the lobby. I threw a coat over my sweats and walked down the 5 flights in my socked feet, my heart pounding at a frequency I hadn't used since I was 12. He was sitting on the 3rd step of the front stoop, his black coat open, elbows resting on his knees. Behind him, a dark car with a driver waited at the curb. He stood up when he saw me. You don't have to thank me, Lucian said before I could open my mouth, but you need to understand that this world doesn't give favors for free. I stopped 2 steps above him. Even then, the height still put us almost eye to eye. And what are you going to charge me? He looked at me for a long moment. The scars on his hands glowed faintly under the yellow light of the street lamp at the corner. Time, he said. Time, I repeated, low. Enough for you to decide whether you want to see what's happening, or whether you want to keep pretending that ordinary collectors knock on the door of an ordinary building of an ordinary family. My family is ordinary. Your family owes money to men who don't collect in ordinary buildings, Isolde. He tilted his head slightly. I bought your father's debt this morning. For now, he owes me, which means the others don't get near you anymore. Then charge me directly. I don't charge you. Why not? He didn't answer. He just held the look. I squeezed the raven card in my coat pocket. I'm not taking your money. I'm not wearing your jewelry. I'm not moving in with you. I'm not Celestine. I know, but you're going to take a driver, he went on, calm, because starting tomorrow, the people who were following your father are going to try following you, and I'm not negotiating that part. I looked at the dark car parked on the corner. The driver, from the front seat, looked at me. He was an older man, broad-shouldered, with the face of someone who'd learned how to wait. Bram, Lucian said without turning. Introduce yourself when she comes out tomorrow. The driver nodded through the glass. I stepped down the last step. I stopped in front of Lucian, chin lifted as high as I could manage. I'll take the driver. I refuse the money. Pause. And don't call me Vera again the way you did at the ball. He tilted his head 0.5 millimeter. What way? Like you knew the name before I said it. Lucian was silent a second longer. When he answered, his voice was lower than it had been all night. Good night, Isolde. He didn't confirm. He didn't deny. He got into the car. The car pulled away. I stayed on the stoop, my sock damp from the dew on the railing, and tried to understand why I felt, in my chest, that I'd just signed a contract without reading the fine print. On Monday night, in the private dining room of a closed-off restaurant at the plaza, Lucian Draven declared me his official date at the charity auction. It was a single sentence. 1. He was seated across from a group of 3 gray-haired men and women, whose necklaces weighed more than my conscience. I had been introduced with a nod and a surname, The conversation revolved around a piece at the Met I would never see from the inside, unless I walked in wearing a staff badge. He waited for the silence between two courses and said, with his usual calm, "Isolde will be with me at the Whitford auction next week." Brief silence. Glances exchanged. One of the women raised an eyebrow so high it nearly touched her hair. I felt my father, to my right, freeze with his fork in the air. "Lucian," one of the women began, smiling. "This is news." "It is." There was no further explanation. There was nothing more to say. Lucian Draven didn't justify his choices, and the world had learned that a long time ago. The conversation resumed in a different tone, more careful, more formal, with that exaggerated courtesy people used when they realized the board had changed the rules mid-game. My father didn't touch his food the rest of dinner. When we left the restaurant, in the car on the way home, he grabbed my wrist at the door before I could step out. "You're going to refuse," he said, his voice low, urgent, looking at me for the first time in years like I was a person instead of furniture. "Tomorrow morning you send word, Isolde. You don't know who Lucian Draven is. He doesn't choose anyone by accident. Ever. If he placed you next to him in public, it's because you're useful for something you can't see." I looked at his hand on my wrist. I looked at his face. And somewhere inside me, in an old and silent place, where I kept every time he had let Celestine into my room without knocking, every time he had ignored a snide remark from my sister, every time he'd made me leave work early to listen to a collector on his behalf, somewhere inside me, something just ended. "You never defended me from anything in your life, Dad," I said, pulling my wrist away slowly. "Don't start now." He went pale. "Isolde, I'm going to the auction. Isolde, you don't understand. Good night, Dad." I got out of the car. I walked up the stairs of the building in silence, hearing only my own footsteps on the cold concrete, and when I got to the apartment door I was shaking, not from fear, from something else I didn't have a name for. I went in, closed the door, turned on only the kitchen light, put the kettle on and opened my bag to find the sweet tea sachet I always carried, and my fingers bumped against the white card with the raven engraved on it. I turned the card over in my palm. There was no number, no address, no sentence, just the blackbird, its wings half open, looking sideways as if deciding whether to fly or stay. I thought about Lucian's hand on my waist. I thought about the short, involuntary squeeze of his fingers when I said Vera. I thought about the 3 small scars on the back of his right hand. And, for the first time since the night of the ball, I thought about the question I'd been pushing down the back of my throat for 3 days. Why had he crossed that ballroom? The kettle whistled. I didn't move. Outside, on the corner, a dark car sat with its engine running, waiting for the dawn. In Chapter 3, Scars and Old Ink. The first week after the ball passed, as if the air had changed density around me. I kept taking the subway to the gallery, kept checking spreadsheets no one would read, kept paying the gas bill with whatever was left of my paycheck after my father's debts. From the outside, it was the same routine. On the inside, I was a woman who had taken Lucian Draven's hand in front of an entire ballroom and still didn't know what she had taken along with it. That week, I started finding on my desk at the gallery, on random mornings, paper bags with vegetable soup or fresh bread. No note. It happened the first time on a day I hadn't eaten since the night before, and I wanted to believe it was a coincidence. I vaguely remembered the dinner at the plaza, my clenched hands in my lap, while Lucian spoke to the others without seeming to notice me, and I realized, too late, that he had noticed. I didn't mention it to anyone. I kept the receipt in a drawer because throwing it away felt like ingratitude. "Like," Ren said, leaning her hip against my desk, "either you have a secret admirer with a soup fetish, or the guy in the expensive coat figured out you don't eat when you're stressed. I saw an old movie just like this. The lead ended up in love, and he ended up in prison. Pick which ending you want." I laughed without meaning to, and the laugh turned into a half sigh. Ren stared at me 2 seconds too long, opened her mouth to say something else, and let it go. It was the first time she'd cut me a break. In the afternoon, the gallery curator, that man with round glasses who, since my first month there, always found a reason to touch my elbow while explaining composition, touched my elbow while I was pointing at a catalog. It was a banal touch, the kind I'd learned to ignore for years. I looked up, and across the street, standing next to a dark car, Lucian was watching through the gallery window. There was no anger on his face. There was nothing. It was a silence shaped like a man, and even at that distance, through the gallery glass, I felt the weight of his gaze travel down my elbow to the curator's hand. The curator went on talking about composition and light, oblivious. The next day, I found out his contract had been terminated without notice. Ren brought me the news laughing, with no idea of the connection. I faked surprise and felt, for the first time, the weight of being watched by someone who made decisions without asking. The following Tuesday, at the bookshop where I used to have tea in the middle of the afternoon, a cramped little cubicle wedged between a frame shop and a laundromat, with shelves that smelled like old paper and dark wood varnish, and a metal bell that jangled every time the door opened, I found Lucian leaning against a poetry shelf. He was holding a book upside down. He wasn't faking it well. He was faking it badly, on purpose, as if he wanted me to see. I walked past him without saying a thing, turned his page over with the tip of my index finger, and went to the counter. Neither of us said a word. When I came back with the cup, he had stepped off the shelf, and the book was back where it belonged. "You read French?" I asked without looking. "I read enough," he answered. "How long have you been drinking the same tea? Since I figured out cheap sweetness covers cheap leaves." I could almost hear the corner of his mouth lift a millimeter. It was the first time I thought maybe Lucian Draven laughed when nobody was watching. The idea unsettled me the rest of the day. On Thursday night, he asked me to a reception on the rooftop of a hotel I would never have set foot in on my own. Cold wind, low lights, conversations I couldn't keep up with. At some point, I left my shawl folded on a chair and walked to the railing, because I needed to breathe away from the glare. The stone railing was damp under my palms, and the city smelled in layers. Wet asphalt, kitchen smoke from some restaurant blocks below, expensive perfume left behind by someone passing through. Lucian appeared behind me without making a sound. He put his own coat over my shoulders, and his hand stayed at my back, longer than any gesture should last. The fabric still held the warmth of his body, and for a second I closed my eyes just to register it. I didn't turn. He didn't speak. We stayed like that, the city breathing below, until someone called him from inside. Saturday night, he insisted I stop by his apartment before going home. Said there was a document I needed to sign for the charity auction. Bram drove me. In the lobby of the building, 2 men in dark suits were dragging a third one, short and bleeding, his face swollen on one side, and his jacket stained with something I chose not to name. They saw me, hesitated for half a second, and kept moving toward a side door. Bram, beside me, commented with the calm of someone reading the weather. "It's going to rain, ma'am. Smells like a bad weekend." Bram, that man was bleeding. Had bled. Different thing. I rode the elevator up alone. Lucian was waiting for me on the landing of his floor, his shirt sleeve carelessly rolled up for the first time, with the look of someone who already knew that I knew. The doors closed behind me, and the corridor stretched too long. "Don't treat me like an idiot," I said before he could speak. I saw. He didn't look away. He didn't try to fix his shirt or his face. He just stepped back half a pace from me, the way someone gives room for a decision to be made. "This is my world, Isolde," he answered, his voice lower than I expected. "You decide whether you want to see it. I'm not going to paint the wall a different color so you'll stay. And if I don't want to see it, then I take you home now, and none of this ever touches you again. You never see this lobby again, or that man, or me for that matter." I swallowed. I looked at his hand, resting against his thigh, with those thin scars I'd been trying not to notice since the dance floor. I thought about my mother, who had died without anyone explaining to me what had really happened. I thought about my father, who had spent his whole life hiding the size of the holes. I thought about myself, the sentence raised in a glass, the laughter still buzzing somewhere in the back of my skull like a cicada that wouldn't die. "I want to see," I said, "but if I'm going to look, you're going to have one rule, just one. Never lie to me." He took too long to answer. 1 second longer than I wanted. "I never lie," he said, finally. I didn't realize then that there was a whole gap between lying and omitting. It wasn't in my vocabulary yet. Lucian took a short step and nodded toward the living room. I followed. Instead of handing me the document, he poured water into a crystal glass and stood at the window. The city lights drew yellow lines on his face, and for a moment his profile looked younger than he was, as if the confession that hadn't come yet was already smoothing some years off him. "I lost my mother when I was young," he said, without turning around. "A betrayal inside my own circle. I learned very early that home is sometimes the most dangerous place. That was all. He didn't say her name. He didn't say how old he was. He didn't say who betrayed him, or how. He just handed me a piece of a scar, and the scar landed on the floor between us, like a living thing. I didn't ask. In that moment, asking felt like something I'd have to earn over time. I looked at his hands, marked, and something in my breathing shifted altitude. I registered the crack the way you register an address you don't intend to visit yet. Bram drove me home a little before midnight. The rain had started, fine and steady, and he commented that traffic would be worse on the bridge. I looked out the window without seeing, with the strange feeling that I was carrying a sentence inside me that didn't have a shape yet. The next morning, I met Hester Kane. I didn't know her. She was an older woman with silver hair pinned back with a simple clip, sitting in a small coffee shop near my apartment, with a cup of black coffee in front of her. She looked up when I walked into the bakery next door to buy a roll, and stopped breathing for a second. I stopped too, without understanding why. She rose slowly, crossed the space between us, and said, with a voice that chose each word, "Pardon the intrusion, dear. You have Mireya's eyes." The floor shifted inside my body. It had been 12 years since anyone told me I had anything of my mother. "You knew her?" My voice came out smaller than I wanted. "I worked with her, a long time ago." Hester pointed to the chair across from her. "Do you have 5 minutes for an old woman?" I sat. I forgot the sandwich, the gallery, the time. Hester spoke little and slowly, hands resting around her cup, as if that coffee were the only anchor she had that morning. She said she had been my mother's secretary for a few years. She said Mireya was one of the most careful people she had ever known, the kind who hid the important things where no one would look. Before she stood up, she pulled from her bag a small object wrapped in a cotton handkerchief. She unfolded the handkerchief on the table with the delicacy of someone unwrapping a relic, and the faint scent of lavender kept in an old drawer rose with it. It was an antique fountain pen, with a dark body and silver detailing worn by time. I recognized it without having to think. My mother used to write notes in my lunchbox with that pen in slanted handwriting when I was little. "She asked me to keep it and give it to you when I saw in your face that you were ready," Hester said. "I saw it today. Your mother always hid important things where no one would look, dear. Remember that." I took the pen in both hands, as if it might fall apart. The metal was cold, then warm from my touch. Hester slid a small card to me with a phone number, and her name written in pencil. "When you need it," she said. "Not before." She left without finishing her coffee. I stayed there for minutes I couldn't count. I put the pen at the bottom of my bag, between the empty change purse and the raven card Bram had given me days before, with no suspicion that the barrel was hollow, with no suspicion that the phrase, "where no one would look," had an address. I went home through the fine rain, my coat soaked, with the feeling of carrying 2 people inside my bag, my dead mother and the man who had told me, the night before, that he had also learned, very early, how to lose one. That night, lying in my narrow bed, with the pen on the nightstand and my breathing still off-tempo, I stared at the ceiling. Lucian had spoken of his mother. Hester had spoken of mine. The 2 threads crossed without making a knot, and I should have felt something, some coincidence, some warning. But all my life I had learned not to trust coincidences, and that's exactly why I let the sentence slide. Before turning off the light, I picked up the pen and rolled it between my fingers. I pressed the cap. I felt the cold metal barrel, solid, indifferent. I thought about writing something to my mother, and realized I'd never had an address to send a letter to. I turned off the light. The rain went on outside, tapping in a tiny rhythm on the windowsill. Somewhere in the city, Lucian Draven was awake, and somewhere else, farther away, someone was already preparing a box that would take 3 months to arrive. I had no idea about any of that. I fell asleep with Mireya's pen in my hand, and Lucien's confession in my head, and for a few minutes before sleep, I thought I was starting to understand the game. It was the quietest night I'd had in many years. It was also, I would find out later, the last night I slept without questions. Chapter 4. The Card That Won't Stay Quiet. Lucian arrived at Augustus's apartment on a Monday in the late afternoon. No warning, no Bram, no ceremony. He knocked once, waited. When I opened the door, he already had the look of a man bringing bad news wrapped in good manners. His cologne, woody and dry, entered the hallway before his body did. "Get your coat," he said. "We talk in the car." It wasn't a request. I got my coat. Bram drove without commenting on traffic or weather. Lucian, beside me in the back seat, waited 3 blocks before speaking. The leather of the seat creaked softly with each turn, and the heater blew a warm hum that didn't take the cold from my hands. When he spoke, it was without preamble. "Your sister negotiated a marriage with Alaric Vale. In exchange, she promised to hand over old documents from your family, documents capable of bringing me down." I absorbed the sentence in pieces. Celestine had always wanted a bigger name than ours. That she had picked the right name for it didn't surprise me. That she had used our mother's surname as currency pulled a long silence from me. And me, in all this? I asked. You were the smokescreen, he answered. While the ballroom watched me cross the floor after you, your sister had 2 weeks to close the deal without anyone noticing. I looked out the window. The bare trees passed in stripes. I didn't cry. I was too tired of crying over Celestine. And you're telling me this why? Because I'm going to protect you in public as my wife, he said. Not girlfriend, not date, wife. And anyone who touches you is going to deal with me before they deal with the law. I turned my face slowly. That was where a whole life of crumbs finally climbed up my throat and turned into voice. I won't be a mobster's trophy, Lucian. He didn't blink. Trophies sit on shelves. Queens sit on the board. The line went into me like a clean nail. I stayed quiet for half a minute, and in that half minute I weighed everything. The dinner at the plaza when my father had spat his refusal at me, my mother's ring that Celestine had pawned and never returned, the curator fired without notice, the fountain pen at the bottom of my bag. I accept, I said, with 3 conditions. Name them. I keep working. I don't wear jewelry you buy, and I sleep in my own home. Lucian watched me for a moment, jaw tight, fingers resting on his thigh, with the stillness of a man making heavier decisions than he was letting on. Bram, from the driver's seat, shifted gears with the diplomatic calm I had been learning to read as respect. All 3 accepted, Lucian said. No bargaining? No bargaining. It was the first time I'd seen him give me something without charging time in return. I marked the gesture the way you mark an important date in a notebook. On Wednesday night, I left the gallery later than usual. The street was wet from fine rain, and the headlights of cars streaked long across the asphalt. The damp smell of concrete rose in waves, mixed with the aroma of roasted chestnuts from the corner cart. I walked 2 blocks toward the subway entrance, and noticed, at the second crosswalk, that a black sedan was following too slowly behind me to be casual. I didn't run. I still remember the decision, because it was small, and it was the first. Not to run. I kept walking at the same pace, took out my phone like I was checking the time, and photographed the plate in the rear view of a parked car beside me. As I turned hurriedly to go down into the subway, I scraped my forearm on the rusted corner of the railing. I barely felt it, a thin sting, forgotten the next second. When I entered the stairwell, the sedan accelerated and disappeared around the next corner. Bram was waiting on the other side of the turnstile, even though I hadn't called him. I looked back, toward the street, and understood. He had been following me on foot from the gallery, half a block behind, the way of someone who knew how to walk unseen. Lucian must have set him as a discreet escort since the night of the dinner, and never mentioned it. I didn't comment. I showed him the photo of the plate. Bram looked at the screen, looked at me, and said only, "Steady hand." Pause. More rain coming. Lucian was waiting in his apartment when we got there. There was no drama on his face. There was a contained, calculated anger I had already learned to recognize as jealousy of something else, of not having reached me before the sedan did. He took my wrist as I passed through the door, turned my hand over, and noticed a thin cut on my forearm from the subway railing. Small, stupid, enough. "Kitchen," he said, and led the way. His kitchen was wide, gray and blue, with a marble counter wider than my entire living room. The recessed lights in the ceiling came down cold on the marble, and the rain hit the tall window behind him at an angle. Lucian opened a drawer, pulled out a small kit, and gestured for me to sit on the tall stool. I obeyed. He positioned himself between my knees to reach the cut, sleeve rolled up to the elbow, and when he leaned over my arm, I noticed my breath had stopped somewhere between my lungs and my throat. He cleaned the cut with cotton. The smell of the antiseptic stung, and even so, it was the warmth of his hand just below my elbow that hurt. It hurt something else. "You didn't run," he said, without looking up. "I didn't know if I could outrun their engine." "You knew," he countered. "You didn't run on purpose." I didn't answer. He lifted his eyes to mine, and we were centimeters apart. I could see the whites of his eyes, the dark iris almost without a rim, the shadow of a beard that had grown in over the day. I heard his breath catch. It wasn't my imagination. It was a small, audible stumble, right at the level of my chin. He stepped back first. It was the most elegant and most cruel thing he had ever done to me. He left the cotton on the counter, took half a step back and said, low like a man confessing a weakness, "When I kiss you, Isolde, it's not going to be because you're afraid." I had no words. He closed the kit, put it back in the drawer, and gestured with his chin toward the hallway that led to the guest room. I stood up and went. I didn't sleep. I stared at the white ceiling until I found the veins in the plaster. I thought about the line. I thought about whether fear was the right word for what I was feeling. I thought about my mother, the pen, the curator, his voice saying, "This is my world." When the sky lightened, I was still awake, and I knew, with an uncomfortable certainty, that I had started to want Lucian Draven regardless of ballrooms, of boards, of protection, and of sisters. Thursday passed without me seeing him. Bram drove me from the gallery to home at the end of the day, in silence, and it was only in the car that he reached back and handed me an envelope with the official invitation to Friday's ball. Lucian didn't call, didn't show up. It was his way of giving me the whole day to choose whether I would still go. On Friday night, the second Montclair ball received me with the same yellow light as the first. I arrived on Lucian's arm. Dark dress, no jewelry he had bought, with the simple ring my mother had worn, which I had managed to retrieve from the pawn shop with my own paycheck, on my middle finger. Heads turned. Some women looked down, others looked up. Celestine was near the bar, with Augustus at a middle distance, and her smile cut through the room before I even got close. She crossed toward us. Lucian let go of my arm on purpose, 2 steps before, and I understood that this was the board he had promised me. He wasn't going to answer for me. "Look who got used to it fast," Celestine said, glass already in hand. "Dress with no sparkle. Poor girl hair. You really don't learn, Isolde." "I learned enough not to buy a dress with our mother's ring," I answered. A few heads turned. Celestine laughed without soul, and the sound ricocheted off the chandeliers like glass hitting glass. "You think he wants you?" she said loudly, drawing the circle in closer. "He only wants you because you're the key to an old war. Ask him about Mom, sweetheart. Ask him. I guarantee you the answer will hurt more than anything I've ever said to you." The line cut through me. For 2 seconds I almost believed her, and in that little piece of time I remembered Lucian's grip on my wrist on the dance floor, his pause before promising not to lie, the coat on the rooftop. Almost believed her, and almost was the word that saved me. "If I'm the key," I said, and it was the first time in my life I'd heard my own voice rise in a ballroom without trembling. "Your job was to be the lock, and you failed at even that, Celestine." The silence came differently this time. It wasn't the silence of people laughing at the humiliated one. It was the silence of people who just realized they were on the wrong side of the floor. Lucian then took the step. Just one. He pulled a thin envelope from the inside pocket of his jacket and held it out to the oldest man in the circle, a white-haired Montclair with a seat on the board. "Documents belonging to the Vera family," he said, his voice almost bored. "Sold by Celestine Vera to Alaric Vale over the past 2 weeks. Receipt, messages, dates. I believe you'll recognize the handwriting." The man opened the envelope. He read. He lifted his eyes to Celestine without bothering to hide the disgust of someone who had just realized he'd applauded the wrong side. Other hands asked to see. Other eyes scanned the papers. In 2 minutes, the news spread through the room like spilled wine on a white tablecloth, with no taking it back. Celestine tried to laugh. No sound came out. She tried to back toward Augustus, and Augustus, for the first time in 28 years of trophy daughter, took half a step away from her. I didn't feel victory. I felt something deeper, older, more tired. I felt pity, and the pity bothered me more than hatred would have. Lucian came back to my side, but he didn't touch me. He waited. "You want to stay?" he asked low. "No," I answered. "I want to leave." But on my own 2 feet. We walked out the side door, away from the circle, away from the glare. The cold air outside hit my face like a welcome slap. Bram was already with the car pulled up at the curb. I got in. Lucian closed the door behind me with a care that didn't match the man who had just brought a woman down in front of the entire elite. In the car, I looked at my hands. My mother's ring shone faintly on my middle finger. Celestine's question was still there, right where she had planted it. Ask why he knew your name. I didn't ask in that moment. I pressed my lips together and looked out the window, and Lucian, beside me, looked the opposite way, as if he also knew that question was standing between us, waiting. "Take me to my father's place," I said. "Bram will take you." "And you?" He looked at me. For the first time, I saw tiredness on his face. Not weakness. Tiredness. "I'll find you tomorrow. If you want, I'll explain everything, including the part you didn't ask." I didn't answer. Bram started the car. That night, sitting on my narrow bed with the dress still on my body and the fountain pen in the palm of my hand, I rolled Celestine's question between my fingers like a stone. Ask why he knew your name. I knew I was going to ask. I knew I was going to ask soon. And I knew, with a small, cold clarity, that the answer could change everything. The rain started up again on the glass, thicker now, in beats like impatient fingers. Somewhere in the city, Lucian Draven wasn't sleeping either. I turned off the light with my mother's ring still on my finger. I repeated Celestine's question out loud, just so the room would hear, and I realized that, for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the answer. I just wanted it to come from the right mouth. Chapter 5. The Choice in the Rain. I closed the door of Lucian's apartment behind me, and the silence of the hallway got so loud I had to lean against the wall to hear my own breathing. Celestine's question, "Ask why he knew your name," had been pounding in my head since we left the ball, on a short loop, crossing the night of the ball, the drive home, the sound of the rain on the glass. I had tried to push it away while Bram drove. I had tried to push it away going up in the elevator. I hadn't managed. And now, alone in the hallway of his apartment, I already knew I wasn't going to walk through that door without hearing the answer. My mother's ring was heavy on my middle finger, the thin gold cold against my warm skin. The fountain pen was heavy in my palm, as if it carried more than just ink. The second Montclair ball had ended an hour ago, and my dark dress still held the smell of spilled champagne, of Celestine's perfume, and of a night in which, for the first time, I hadn't lowered my head in front of the sister who had finally fallen in front of the elite that had carried her. Lucian came after me. He didn't run. He walked with the calm of a man who already understood what he was going to hear before the sentence even began. "Come in," I said, without turning my face. "I need to talk to you, and I'm not talking in the hallway." He opened the door with his key. He turned on only the lamp in the corner of the living room, as if he knew that full light would be unbearable for both of us. He took off his jacket, folded it over the back of the sofa, stayed in a white shirt with his sleeves still buttoned. The scars on his hands looked deeper in that low light, pale streaks on the backs, old contours over the knuckles. I walked to the window. The wood of the sill was cold against my fingertips. Outside, the fine rain had started, scratching the glass in slanted lines over the yellow lights of the avenue. "Sit down," he asked. "No." He nodded once. Didn't insist. The silence between us was thick enough to cut, and even so, he waited. He waited like a man who had learned to wait for ambushes, and was waiting for this one too. I turned my body slowly. I faced the man who had crossed a ballroom for me twice, and who, both times, had known exactly what he was crossing. "Did you know my name before that night at the ball?" Lucian didn't look away. His jaw hardened for a second, and it was in that second that I knew. The answer was already on his face before his mouth opened. "Yes," he said. "The word entered me like the Raven card had entered my father's apartment weeks before. Clean, definitive, without visible violence, and for that reason, worse." "How long?" "Years," he answered, and the word hung between us. "How many?" He took a deep breath. His chest rose and fell all at once, like a man bracing for a hit. "Long enough that night at the Montclair ball wasn't a coincidence." I pressed a hand against the wall to keep from sitting down on the floor. The wallpaper was soft, expensive, the kind that cost an entire month of my father's rent, and it was on it that I propped the weight of a woman who was just finding out she had been found before she knew she was lost. "So, why did you come near me? Strategy?" In part, I repeated, and heard my own voice as if from far away. "In part is the most cowardly word I have ever heard you say." Lucian made a minimal movement, 2 steps toward me, and stopped the exact instant I raised my hand. He learned fast. He always did. "You knew I was Augustus Vera's daughter," I said, and my voice came out with the strange calm that comes before tears. "You knew the gallery was going under. You knew about the debts. You knew what had to be offered for a woman like me to accept the hand of a man like you. How much of that was calculation, Lucian? How much of that was a gesture?" "It was all calculation in the beginning," he answered, and I admired, for a tiny instant, the courage of the answer. It was calculation to cross the ballroom. It was calculation to push the collectors away. It was calculation to say, "Dance with me." And then, he swallowed dry. His Adam's apple moved up and down as if he were carrying stones. Then it stopped being. "When? When you gave me back the dress. When you refused the jewelry. When you stayed silent about the bleeding man in the lobby, and still looked at me in the elevator as if I weren't a monster." He paused. His voice dropped lower, almost a whisper against the sound of the rain thickening on the window. "The one thing I didn't plan, Isolde, was needing you." I didn't believe him immediately, but I also couldn't not believe him, and that crack between the two verbs was exactly where I was standing. "Did you come near me because of my father? Because of the Vera name? Because of a debt he has with you that I don't even know about?" There was a pause, too short for me, too long for him. "The story of the Vera name is older than your father," Lucian said, "and I'm not going to explain all of it tonight. Not because I want to hide it, because if I throw it all at you now, you won't hear me through to the end. Then don't listen to me either," I answered. "Because I won't be able to hear you all the way through tonight either." I picked up my bag from the sofa. The leather was soft, worn smooth at the strap from use. My mother's pen was inside, and I gripped the fabric over it like it was a talisman. The ring stayed on my finger. Lucian didn't move to stop me. "Where are you going?" he asked, and it was the first time that night his voice shook. "I don't know. Out into the rain. Anywhere that doesn't have your silence in it." He nodded once more. "Bram is downstairs. Take the car." "No, Isolde." I said, "No, Lucian. If you put me in a car of yours now, I'll never know if I left here on my own legs or on yours." He closed his eyes for a second. When he opened them, I saw for the first time the man behind the boss. It wasn't a relief. It was worse. Because the man behind the boss had the same eyes as the child he had been once, and I didn't want to feel pity for him now. I opened the apartment door and walked to the elevator without looking back. The hallway carpet muffled my footsteps, and even so, I heard each one as if they were echoing. The rain was already steady when I stepped onto the sidewalk. I had no umbrella, no coat, no plan. The cold water cut through the silk of the dress in seconds, and the smell of the street rose up. Wet asphalt, the sweet smoke of some restaurant on the corner, the damp breath of the city. I walked along the outside of his building like a woman who hadn't yet decided whether she was the same one she'd been an hour ago. I thought about my mother. I thought about her dead 12 years, in a car that had gone off on its own around a curve with no rain, no reason, no witness. I thought about her small hands braiding my hair in the kitchen, separating the dark strands from the red ones, as if each color had its own story. I thought about my father signing papers he didn't read, parading Celestine, and ignoring my name on every birthday he forgot. I thought about my sister raising her glass and reducing me to a sentence. I thought about myself, at 12, at 15, at 20, at 24, lowering my head every time someone laughed at my silence. And I thought about Lucian Draven, about the second he held my wrist when he heard Vera, about the coat on the rooftop, about the food without a note, about the man who knew I didn't like jewelry and still gave me a queen as a gift on the board. I cried standing in the rain, for the first time without anywhere to hide my face. I didn't cry loudly. I didn't cry ugly. I cried the way a woman cries when she finally understands that humiliation isn't only public. It has been living inside her for too long to know how to leave on its own. The tears mixed with the rain, and it was almost a relief, because nobody could point at me and say there was crying. I started walking, with no direction, no coat, no plan. Water ran down my hair to my back, and the dress hung on me like a second body. I passed one corner, then another. The dark storefronts gave me back the shape of a woman I didn't recognize at first, and it was that strangeness that stopped me. 12 years of crumbs came together, out of order. My mother's hand braiding my hair, my father's silence whenever Celestine walked into my room, the ring on my sister's wrong finger, the collectors on Friday mornings, the ballroom laughter, and, in the middle of it all, Lucian, the man who had crossed the floor, and the man who had been hiding for years. It all hit me at once, in the same breath, and I stood there on the sidewalk letting the rain come down while the weight settled. It didn't hurt less for having a name. It hurt differently. When I turned around, Lucian was on the front steps of the building. No coat, no umbrella, a white shirt sticking to his chest, see-through over the skin, showing the outline of scars I had never seen in open light. His dark hair ran down his forehead in heavy strands. He didn't come down the last step. He stayed there, at the exact height where I could either go to him or turn my back, and that, I realized, was the position he had chosen on purpose. "I'm not going to follow you, Isolde," he said, and the rain almost swallowed his voice. "I came out here because, if you leave, I need to see you go." I stayed on the sidewalk. The water ran down my neck, down my back, down my spine in cold lines. "I'm not going to offer you forever," he went on. "I'm not going to give you jewelry to buy you. I'm not going to lock your door. I'm not going to pay for the gallery or push your father off the board. I've already done all that, and none of it was you choosing me. It was you being chosen." He took a deep breath, and I watched his chest rise slowly beneath the soaked shirt. "If you stay, it's going to be because you chose me too. And if you go, I won't send anyone after you. That is the one thing I will never take from you, Isolde Vera. Your choice." I had never heard those words from anyone, not from my father, who chose for me whenever he could, not from my sister, who chose me as a shadow before I'd even learned to walk, not from the collectors, Not from the bosses. Not from the men who'd looked at me like furniture at the gallery. The word choice was a language nobody had bothered to teach me, and there in the rain, a dangerous man was handing me the whole dictionary. I stepped up one step. The stone was wet and cold beneath the thin sole of my shoe. Then I stepped up another. The rain fell between us, and I stopped close enough to see the tremor in his jaw. It was a small tremor, restrained by years of practice, but it was a tremor. I looked at the dangerous man, and I looked at the man trembling in silence. The two were the same person. That was the most terrifying thing of all, and that was, I already knew, what had held me from the very first second in the ballroom. I raised my hand and touched his face, slowly. His skin was cold on the outside and warm on the inside, and that contradiction was everything I needed to know about him. My thumb traced the line of his wet jaw, stopped at the corner of his mouth. Lucian closed his eyes as if it hurt more than any bullet he'd ever taken. "You hid my mother from me," I said, low, close enough that only he could hear, close enough to feel his breath on my chin. "I still don't know the size of that omission, and I'm going to want to know. At some point, Lucian, you're going to tell me the whole story of the Vera name, and I'm going to decide right then whether I stand with you or whether I go alone. I know, but tonight," I went on, and my voice finally broke in the middle of the word. "Tonight I can't lose you before I know if I have you." He opened his eyes. The rain ran down his face as if the whole night had decided to cry for me, and for an instant, the entire city seemed to have stopped breathing to hear what would come next. I opened my mouth to answer. Chapter 6. My Favorite Ruin. I kissed him, not as surrender, not as forgiveness, as a decision. His mouth was cold from the rain and warm inside, and I felt his hand rise slowly to the back of my neck, fingers open, holding on like a man who couldn't believe he was holding anything. The rain came finer now, almost a dust of water on the steps, and the steam of my own breath mixed with his in the small space between our mouths. I pulled back enough to look into his eyes, and saw they were darker than I had ever seen them. Dark, not with anger, but with a surrender even he didn't know he carried. "I'll stay," I said, "but not as your front-row wife, as your real one. And that, Lucian, is more dangerous for you than for me." For the first time since I'd known him, Lucian Draven laughed. It was a short, hoarse sound, scraped by the rain, closer to disbelief than to joy. His chest rose once deeply, as if the air had taken too long to arrive. "Already done, Vera," he answered. "You always were." He took off the soaked shirt and wrapped the jacket I hadn't seen him grab on the way up around my shoulders. The fabric weighed more than it should, weight of rain, and of a whole night of things said, and I let it weigh. His smell came wrapped inside the lining, cold cedar, a trace of whiskey, something metallic I had never been able to name, and that was his alone. Bram was in the car with the engine running and the headlights low. He didn't say a word when we got in. He just looked in the rearview mirror once, registered that I was beside Lucian instead of on the curb, and drove. The small lines at the corner of his eyes moved a millimeter, almost the smile of a man who had already kept enough secrets for this one not to surprise him. The city went past the window of the car as a sequence of lights I didn't need to name. The drops ran vertically and cut the signs into red and blue ribbons. Lucian held my hand between both of his, slowly, thumb passing over my mother's ring without comment. The warmth of his palms climbed up my arm in a slow current. I rested my temple against his wet shoulder and didn't speak. There was something in his silence I had never found in any man's silence. It wasn't the absence of words. It was a presence that didn't need them. When we got to the apartment, he took the jacket from my shoulders, hung it on the hook beside his. It was a small, almost domestic gesture, and for that reason it disarmed me more than any other from that night. 2 coats, side by side, his black, long, the collar still damp. Mine smaller, lighter, leaning against his sleeve as if it already knew its place, as if the closet door had known, before I did, that I wasn't leaving anymore. I took his hand between mine. The scar that cut across the back, from the knuckle of his thumb to his wrist, was a line I had seen dozens of times and never touched without rushing. I touched it now, slowly. I felt the ridge, the hardened skin, the small unevenness where the stitches had been done poorly by someone with more urgency than care. The story he hadn't yet told me had texture. It had temperature. It was a real thing between my fingers. And for 1 second I understood that each scar on that man was a page he had decided not to read to anyone. "Someday you tell me about this one," I said. "Someday," he answered. His voice came out lower than usual, and I noticed he hadn't taken his eyes off my hand over his. He didn't kiss me again, Not there. He just lifted my hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to my wrist, in the exact place where he had unintentionally squeezed his fingers at the first ball when he heard my surname for the first time. The kiss was so light I barely felt it, and even so, I felt it in every other place at the same time. Lucian stood there. Let me. It was the one thing he had to offer me that night without a word, and it was everything. The light in the bedroom was low when he pushed the door open. I walked in first. Lucian came behind, and the door eased shut against the frame. Shrucker, and whirr. When I opened my eyes, the light was a pale gray of a late winter morning. Lucian's shirt was on my body, too long at the shoulders, with his smell trapped in the collar. The other side of the bed was empty, but the sheet still held the warmth, a deep impression of his weight that I covered with my hand for an instant, like someone confirming something small and enormous at the same time. I stayed there a few seconds, feeling the silence. It was a different silence. It wasn't the silence of my father's apartment, which always had something collecting on the other side of the door. A yellow envelope, a short doorbell, a phone that rang 3 times and hung up. It wasn't the silence of the guest room, where I had spent the night awake a few weeks before, counting the cracks in the ceiling so I wouldn't count my heartbeats. It was the silence of a morning where no one needed to explain to me where I was. Outside, the city had already started its muffled rumor of distant horns, a delivery truck backing up, the short bell of an elevator on the floor below. Everything came in muted through the double windows, as if life were happening at a volume that respected this bedroom. I put my bare feet down on the rug and followed the smell of coffee. Lucian was in the kitchen, barefoot, dark pajama pants, no shirt, hair tousled from actually having slept. It was a version of him no one in the world knew. The scars on his back showed up more in the morning light than they did under party light. 3 thin lines on the left shoulder, a wider, older mark below the shoulder blade, all with the calm look of wounds that had finished hurting. I registered in silence that this was a privilege I was never going to waste. He turned when he heard me. "Coffee," he said, with that hoarse voice from the start of the day. "Bitter." "Tea," I answered, and leaned against the counter. The stone of the counter was cold under my palm. The steam from the 2 cups rose in 2 parallel columns, and the light from the window cut through the steam in a way that looked intentional. Lucian already had his cup in his right hand. He pushed a second cup toward me, handle turned toward me. Tea, sweet, the way I'd drunk it since I was a girl without him having to ask. I held the cup with both hands and felt the steam rise up my face. The heat went down my fingers and settled in the depth of my chest like a small certainty. "You knew I drink sweet tea too," I said. "I did. How long?" He looked at me over the rim of his cup. His eyes had, in that instant, the color of a storm that had already passed, since the Tuesdays at the bookshop. I smiled small. I didn't comment. Some things I'd learned the night before are answered in long conversations. Others, in a gesture. That man had learned my life in silence, from the corners of ballrooms and the counters of bookshops, and he had kept every detail like a man stockpiles ammunition, not to use against me, but to use for me at the moment I didn't even know I'd need it. I walked around the counter and went to him. I pressed my forehead against his chest. His skin was warm, the smell still damp from a recent shower, and the sound of his heart came steady against my forehead, a little faster than normal just because I was there. Lucian set down the cup, opened a hand at the back of my neck, and stood still, as if breathing beside me was a task that required full attention. For a few seconds, I breathed like a woman who was finally wanted. No ring, no promise of forever, no wedding date. Just the 2 of us, barefoot, in a kitchen that smelled of bitter coffee and sweet tea, on the morning after the night I had decided to stay. "I have to go to work," I said against the skin of his chest. "I know. Don't ask me to skip." "Wasn't going to." I laughed low, and the laugh made his forehead lean lightly against the top of my head. "You liar, you," I murmured against his skin. "Technically," he answered, and his voice had the thin thread of dry humor I had learned to recognize. "I haven't asked yet. But you would, probably." I pulled back enough to look into his eyes. His hand stayed on the back of my neck, fingers open, weightless, just reminding me they were there. "Lucian, I know. Go to work." I took the last sip of tea. The sweetness lingered an instant on the tip of my tongue. I went back to the bedroom, changed his shirt for my blouse, put on my shoes, picked up my bag. My mother's fountain pen was inside, the way I'd left it, leaning against the satin lining beside my keys. I took the metal barrel between my fingers for a moment, feeling the small weight of that old object, the slight cold of the aged bronze against my thumbprint, and thought briefly, like someone scratching a mosquito bite without noticing. Why did he hold my wrist when he heard my surname at the ball? The question came and went in my head in less than a second. Maybe it was the tiredness of a short night. Maybe it was the wish not to look for shadow on a morning that had light. I smiled to myself, a small smile, at the corner of my mouth, the kind nobody chooses, the kind that comes before the choosing. I put the pen back in my bag, closed the zipper. Lucian was waiting for me at the door. He had put on a gray shirt, no tie, with the cuffs still open. His hair was still tousled, and there was a faint pillow mark on the corner of his face I had never seen before. He held my face between both scarred hands and kissed me on the forehead, slowly, in the same place he had pressed his lips to my wrist the night before. "Come back tonight," he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an order either. It was a statement, said low, the kind that only works between two people who have already decided the same thing in silence. "I'll come back." I opened the door. I looked one more time at the barefoot man in the kitchen of the apartment I could now, without fear, call home. Lucian leaned against the counter with the bitter cup in his hand, hair in his face and the corner of his mouth almost lifted. The gray light from the window fell on him at a slant, caught on the scars of his forearm, and made of him a figure I never would have imagined I'd get to keep for myself. My favorite ruin, I didn't think yet, because he hadn't called me that out loud yet, but I would think it, on some near day, and I'd recognize on the spot that the line had already been there, that morning, in the curve of his mouth, waiting to be said. I closed the door, and for the first time in 24 years, I closed a door behind me knowing there was someone on the other side waiting to open it again. 3 months later, I slept in Lucian Draven's bed, as if that dangerous man were home to me. He poured me sweet tea, kissed my forehead before leaving, and came back early just to find me awake, with his warm hand sliding over my waist, as if I were the one thing he didn't want to lose. I thought I knew the monster sleeping beside me. I thought I had tamed him, until the box arrived with no return address. Inside there were photos of my dead mother, erased records, and an old tape. I pressed play, and heard the young voice of Lucian saying that the Vera problem needed to be ended before dawn. I froze with my finger on the button, because that was when I understood. I hadn't been saved by a mobster at that ball. I was sleeping with my mother's killer. Then the absolute shock hit. I had spent the last 3 months opening my legs, whispering his name, believing in him, loving him, and the question that remains is, what was he about to do to me?